to the opening of this exhibit, 40 Acres in the American Revolution, Stories of Independence and Servitude. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the general context of this exhibit, the challenges and the excitements of doing it, and then introduce the really remarkable set of graduate students from the University of Massachusetts history programs who have done the research to support this exhibit and then turned it into So this is, you may be aware, the semi-centennial of the American Revolution here in Massachusetts that gets counted from 1775. But of course the federal government also had many grants and awards trying to think about what it meant for the United States to be 250 years old. And quite remarkably in 2024, Porter Phelps Huntington was awarded 2 federal grants. And I think you have to think about that whole nation, little tiny museum in Hadley, from the Institute of Museum and Library Services and from the National Endowment for the Humanities. And they were grants to tell a more complicated story about the American Revolution, a story that talked about independence and talked about the war, but also talked about enslavement, talked about indentured labor, talked about the inequalities and contradictions in the American Revolution. So we were awarded 2 grants in 2024, and were able to hire 2 remarkable graduate students to start doing research into stories that we knew a tiny little bit about, but knew that there were enormous gaps in what we knew in terms of the people who were enslaved at this site in the 1770s, so during the time of the Revolution. And also, we knew that there were British prisoners of war who had been indentured as labor on this site. And the museum, so that house over there was built in 1752. And if you haven't done one of the recent tours of it, you should come back some afternoon and do that. But really, from the very moment that people moved into this house to when Moses and Elizabeth Porter built this house, they came here with enslaved labor. And so the stories of the development of this farmstead are also stories of enslavement in Massachusetts. And we tend in Massachusetts to like to talk a lot about our abolitionist 19th century. We don't really like to talk that much about our enslavement 18th century. But that's part of the history of this place. And so understanding that is an important thing. That house stayed in the Porter and then Phelps and then Huntington family. That ridiculous name is because the museum's buildings got passed down through daughters. And so they would marry, get a new last name, and the name got longer. Because it stayed in the same family until the mid-20th century, they kept things. They never moved. They didn't have to throw things out. So not only is the house really unusual for houses of this era for having so much original furnishings, being so full of things that belonged to the family, but they also kept the paper records. And the things about paper records is that they tell all sorts of stories you might not have had in mind when you were keeping them, right? So I kept this letter because it was written to me by my husband, say, when he was in Boston, and I was here. I'm now being Elizabeth Phelps, so sorry. But in that moment, you might also talk about doing the laundry, or who's helping make cheese, or all sorts of daily labor things. And so, and there also are economic records, account book kind of records, those sorts of records. So there's actually not just a history of this family in this site, but a history of a much broader community of the people who worked and lived here. But only from what people in this family decided to keep of those records. And so we had some ideas about the stories of the people enslaved here in the 1770s and these people who had been soldiers for the British Army and then ended up working here. We had stories about them in the family papers, but we never had resources until these federal grants to be able to look beyond, to be able to send scholars out to look into other places, other collections. And so that's this great gift. And so I want to say two things. One is know how important the National Endowment for the Humanities and the Institute for Museum and Library Sciences are for building the things we can know. And also say, in April, we too received letters saying your grants have been terminated. And so while we were able to finish this project, and I also want to give words of thanks to the Massachusetts Office of Tourism and Travel and Tourism, who gave us some money to be able to make the, move the information into this beautiful form. But other parts of the work that we had outlined to do in those grants, where we need to figure out how to fund them now, because like so many things, we're entering into the United States 250th year with holes in what it is that what it is that the nation is valuing. So it's really, it makes it particularly sort of moving and important to me right now to be able to tell this story, to be able to tell a more complicated story about America's family at a moment when there are so many pressures to only tell celebratory stories. So just really glad to be here, glad that you're all here. And now I'm going to introduce our wonderful researchers. Olivia Haynes is a PhD candidate in the W.E.B. Du Bois Department of Afro-American Studies at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst, where she's also completed the graduate certificate in public history. Her research focuses on the history of slavery in the American North, with an emphasis on the visual and material culture of slavery, social reproduction theory, and Black motherhood and reproduction under enslavement and nominal freedom. Emily Whitted is a PhD candidate in the History Department at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst. As a public historian and museum professional, she's recently worked on several projects about the American Revolution for the 250th, including the exhibition The Doan Gang, Outlaws of the Revolution at the Mercer Museum in Doylestown, PA, and a study of women in the American Revolution with the National Park Service's Northeast region. Emily also holds an MA degree from the Winterthur Program in American Material Culture at the University of Delaware. And finally, Elizabeth Pangburn, who we're so lucky to have as the humanities coordinator at the Porterfeld Huntington Museum for the last 2 years. She's a PhD student in history at the University of Massachusetts Amherst with a certificate in public history. And she also holds a Master's of Fine Arts degree in costume design from UMass. In addition to her work at the Porterfeld Huntington Museum, she serves as a consultant for Historic Northampton, an archivist and interpreter for the LeGibb Archive, and co-artistic director for a decade of theater truck. Elizabeth has taught courses in history, theater, and costume design at UMass, Westfield State, and Holyoke. We're going to do this more like a conversation. I'm going to sit down, I think. But tell us, because if it doesn't work for us sitting down, we could like all stand up too. But I think maybe I'll start with Emily a little bit and just ask you, what were the things that, well, what were you asked to be sent out to find? And we can talk a little bit about how you went about looking for it and what you found.
So I was tasked with looking at really 4 figures, all of whom were connected with military experiences during the American Revolution. The first is a man named Caesar, who was enslaved here at 40 Acres, and then is enlisted in the Continental Army, and we knew that he was at Fort Ticonderoga in the year 1776. The second was John Morrison, who was a Scottish man enrolled in the 71st Regiment of Foot in British military, who eventually arrived at 40 Acres as a prisoner of war. And the third is really a couple, George and Mary Andrews, who were a German husband and wife who family history had said were a Hessian soldier, and we assumed Mary was with him as a camp follower, who were German soldiers fighting on the side of the British during the American Revolution and came to 40 Acres in 1782 as indentured servants. We knew, I think, a good amount of history for those figures associated with 40 Acres in the geography here. But I think the gaps that the museum was hoping to fill were about their experiences away from 40 Acres, either before the American Revolution, or before they arrived, or after they had departed from 40 Acres. And so my research road took me primarily to Fort Ticonderoga, as well as Massachusetts State Archives, and also allowed me to collaborate and connect with a host of experts in different branches of this military history. I communicated with folks in the UK, scholars who focus on the history of German soldiers here during the war, as well as curators and archivists. And I think we went in knowing that we'd be grateful for any additional information about these figures, and some we learned more than others. I think what was most exciting to me was to follow the trail of Caesar. As an enslaved man, we knew that he was involved with the Continental Army because he wrote a very extraordinary letter that is in the family papers, and I encourage you all to spend some time reading the words more closely on the panel after this chat, if you haven't seen it already. But I think we're looking to both contextualize and understand the complications of his experience as both an enslaved man but also an enlisted soldier in the Continental Army, and understand his experience a little bit more. We also don't know what happened to him after this letter, and so we were hoping to get more information about where he might have gone next. And I think Fort Ticonderoga staff were wonderful in helping me to understand the daily experiences of Fort Ticonderoga as a military space. We were able to find a muster roll listing him, and we knew he was we knew the captain and the colonel who he served under. We also know that he was tapped as a servant for the captain of his company. So his military duties involved working within that captain's household, doing domestic tasks and caring for him, which may not have been the military service that he had imagined for himself. While we still don't know what happens to him after December of 1776, I think the archive leaves some gaps and ambiguity there, that he may have made a choice to self-emancipate and to leave both the military and never return to 40 Acres and return to a site of enslavement. And I think that's maybe, as much as I would have wanted more concrete answers, I think that's an exciting opening that we can leave open to interpretation.
Can I just want to interrupt you a little bit and let you help us partly also to say everybody has to come out and like really read the exhibit. But, so this letter is the letter that Caesar Phelps wrote to Charles Phelps and is in the Porter Phelps Huntington family papers. And he talks about working for Captain Cranston and not liking it, not intending to stay if he can help it, he says. And he asks other questions too. But this is the one thing we had, and it's dated in September. So tell us about this document up here.
Sure. So one of the complications with tracing experiences of enslaved people in paper archives is that last names are not always a given. Often we may only have a first name for an enslaved man or woman, and last names often are a reflection of their enslavers and the circumstances of being in a household of their enslaver rather than a last name that they had chosen for themselves. And so this letter is signed Caesar Phelps, and I think archivists and researchers prior to me had used that first and last name combination to look at military records and had not found anyone by that first and last name in other muster rolls. But after tracing kind of the archival line through the Captain Cranston, we discovered for his company a muster roll that postdates the letter. It's in November of 1776, and Caesar is listed as Caesar Cranston rather than Caesar Phelps. And that's a reflection of his status as a servant within Cranston's household at Fort Ticonderoga. And there is no other Caesar Cranston listed in any muster roll at the State Archives besides this one. But you can see also he's listed among other soldiers of color in this muster. So just above him, someone is listed as slave barber. So we know that he is not the only soldier of color in this company, and likely this last name was put upon him rather than one he chose himself yet again. Again, one of the complications of researching his experience in these archives. But I think it's an exciting document because it shows the date in which he is enlisted. It shows that he was a private in the company, and had all the status of a Continental Army soldier despite his enslaved status, but clearly in a role that he was not finding agreeable, or the work was not what he would have preferred to be doing.
And these columns that we're not really seeing here, like he's blank on those?
Yes. So muster rolls are often adjusted and adapted over time to show what's happening to soldiers in the military. So if they get sick, it sometimes mentions that they're in the hospital. If they decide to re-enlist, it will list their re-enlistment date, and where they might go. And Caesar's line is completely blank. So we know, at least at this point, in November 1776, he's not injured or ill, he's not killed in action, but he's also not decided to re-enlist in a new grouping. And December 1776 is a point where most Continental Army soldiers have to re-enlist before January and get assigned elsewhere. So it's a moment where he is probably pressured to make some sort of decision. We just don't know what that decision was.
Is this the time you have the conversation? When do you have the conversation part?
We could sort of, I think we could totally say, take a minute, questions about Caesar, and then we can move on to somebody else. That would be, I think that makes a lot of sense. Thank you, my dear.
And I'm going to ask that this community of speakers say who we are. We have voice. I am Onawumi Jean Moss. My response to what you say is emotional and intellectual. The one thing that Caesar does say is in the few lines of his letter. And what he said in the letter was, I want to come home. Could someone read those lines so we can hear his voice? He may have been a Cranston. They changed his name as they pleased. But in his heart, he wanted to come home. And it's in that letter.
Sir, I take this opportunity to inform you that I don't intend to live with Captain Cranston if I can help it. And I would be glad if you would send me a letter that I may get my wages. So that's another issue about who has power to be collecting their wages. For I have not got any of my wages, and I want to know how all the folks do at home, which is part of.
He asked also for a gift. Is that
Yeah.
in his letter?
Well, and I desire your prayers for me
Mhm.
while in the stars. And if you determine to sell me, I want you should send me my stock and buckle, a piece of cloth you wear around your neck and the buckle that closes it. So no more at present, but I remain, and I think this is always a hard line to read, to your ever faithful slave, Caesar Phelps.
And then who was he writing the letter to?
Charles Phelps.
To Beck.
So that's why that letter's been in this collection.
Thank you.
Thank you.
He didn't come home.
And maybe he calls it all the folks he cared about this community. When he asks about how all the folks do at home, he's also asking about other enslaved people in this household, as well as other people working in this household and family members. Folks is a broad term, right? So I think I would say on Onawumi, he cared about people here, but I don't, and he did call this place home in that letter, but I don't know that he was saying, I want to come back to home, so much as I don't want to be in the situation I'm in now, where I'm not getting paid. I don't feel like my relationship with Captain Cranston is feeling like a comfortable, liberating thing for me.
And since this is a conversation, I respectfully disagree.
Okay.
How he wanted to get back here where he had been treated much better than at that other person's house.
Do we know anything about Cranston, about what his background is and
Yeah.
what might have shaped him to have the attitudes that seem evident from that letter?
Yeah, that's a good question. Captain Abner Cranston is from Massachusetts. He actually has a very short time in the military. He dies in early 1777. He's reassigned to another regiment as a captain and passes away in upstate New York right after a battle. Cranston, it's difficult to tell what is causing this tension, but to be tapped as a servant within your own company is a tricky role. It happens sometimes regardless of racial status. Often captains might tap younger family members, such as sons, who they wanted to keep close to them, to maybe get them out of other types of dangerous or dirty service, like digging trenches and building fortifications. But other times, especially in southern regiments, you can see a real racial correlation between that tapping of servants who are also soldiers. And so it's unknown what is causing really this discord, but part of it is that maybe the military experience that Caesar had imagined for himself was not coming to fruition in that role. It might not have been what he pictured he would be doing. It's also a very intimate relationship to have a captain of your company treating you as a subordinate who's dealing with your domestic routines, making you breakfast, tidying your tent, getting provisions, things like that. That might have caused that tension as well. You can also see from this letter that Caesar's very concerned about his wages. And that's in part because he's serving as likely as a substitute for Charles Phelps in the Continental Army. There were quotas placed on every town in Massachusetts to send a certain number of men and enlist them in the Continental Army. Often those quotas were divided by kind of social class. And Charles Phelps being of a higher social class, but also with a level of political energy and agency around the American revolutionary cause already, it might have been a thing that Charles Phelps wished to have substitute, or that maybe Caesar had been looking forward to that opportunity as well, because military experience can lead to so many other opportunities. Across the board, many soldiers of color felt like military service opened some new doors. Whether you were free or enslaved, it could lead to financial opportunities. It could lead to your own physical freedom. You could support the patriot cause and wish for a new status as a citizen in a new nation that you were fighting for. You were protecting family members, maybe back at home. So all of those complex motivations were part of being a soldier of color on the revolutionary side. And wages are on his brain clearly because that payment is something he feels, one, he should deserve as part of his enlistment, but also he might want that money on him in order to access things like extra provisions, clothing, things that are being sold at Fort Ticonderoga that maybe the military is not providing as they should or as regularly as they should.
One thing I'd just like to say is that that's really interesting about the substitute role. And that I'm not a big student of the American Revolution, but more of the antebellum South and the Civil War. And so that practice of substitute was a fundamental part of the way that the slave owning class in the Confederacy was able to advocate for war and do nothing but profit off of it. And the way that they did that, I mean, the myth is that, Robert E. Lee was of the elite class and Jefferson Davis was, and they did all these things, they sacrificed. But the truth is that, and I don't mean to stereotype, but much of the elite that was the biggest supporter of secession and of war used substitutes all the time. And so they would do things like, they wouldn't send their enslaved people as substitutes because the Confederacy did not have black soldiers until the very end of the war. But what they would do is that they would get their son appointed to, say, to be like the local magistrate or some kind of local official, and they could make the argument, well, he's doing public service in support of the state government, which is part of the Confederacy. And there was money exchanged to do those kinds of things, and that was the racket. And it's really interesting to know that that was the pattern in the American War. I didn't know that.
All right, one more. Then we have like many other people to talk about. Yeah.
So it was perhaps the expectation of some of the enslaved men that they might get emancipated, or there might be a path to emancipation. Did that actually happen in the broader sense? It might be beyond your research scope, but I wonder if it did happen.
Yes.
Yes, definitely. There are many examples of enslaved men who are then manumitted either during or after the American Revolution. Often also if you're serving as a substitute but you're collecting wages as a soldier, many enslaved men were using those wages in order to buy their own freedom as well. So there were multiple avenues that could happen. Not to say that was always what happened. Certainly, it was not. But there are many cases where it was.
And that you don't know the Phelps ever promised that.
We have no documentation of his contract. That's all. I'm wondering, maybe we should let Olivia talk a little bit about Peg.
Sure. Yeah, I spent my time, I was brought here to research Margaret Peg Bowen, who was brought to 48 Acres at the age of 12 in 1754. We don't have documentation of where she was brought from, but she spent the bulk of her life in Massachusetts, but for a 6-year period between 1772 and 1778, she was in Bennington, Vermont, and how she got there was she had a partner named Pop Morgan, who was also living in Hadley. They wanted to marry, but their marriage license was denied here, and somehow Peg was able to negotiate her and Pop's sale up to Bennington under Stephen Fay, and she left behind 2 daughters, Rosanna and Phyllis. emphasize, I think if we're engaging with Peg and her movement, I am always very cautious to frame it around like choice, like the choice to leave and to also like put some sort of moral judgment, I think, on her movement and what she did to negotiate whatever sort of autonomy that she did try, an agency she did try to like claim and yeah, hold on to. But yeah, she did have to leave behind her 2 daughters here, and she went to Bennington. And so, well, what I was trying to do, I went up to the Bennington Museum and worked with a lot of lovely folks up there to sort of think about what Peg was doing, if there's any documentation of her in Bennington. The trail kind of goes cold for Pont Morgan once we get up there, but she was living with Stephen Fay, who was a tavern owner. He owned the Catamount Tavern. And that is a hotbed for sort of revolutionary thought. So Ethan Allen frequented the Catamount Tavern. The Green Mountain Boys were there as well. And it was a really interesting site because we witnessed, I was engaging a lot with his like account books. There's only one extant account book, which is, it cites these minute books, so it wasn't as rich as I would like, but there's still a lot there. We see him the patrons of the Catamount Tavern being folks who did own some enslaved people, but then also folks who, like Ebenezer Allen, lived in Bennington, who did have an enslaved woman who he eventually sets free and is very sort of anti-slavery. So they're all sort of frequenting the space, and Peg is there, right? Her name doesn't come up in a lot of records. That was the part that kind of like broke my heart, but that I think is what comes with, I think, researching enslaved women specifically in the domestic space, is that they're not necessarily like in muster rolls or anything like that, but they're there witnessing all of it, right? And serving rum or serving like this cocktail called Flip and serving supper and listening to all of these conversations that are happening. And so in Bennington, and what I was really trying to do, as I was kind of running into a wall, like where's her name, where's her handwriting, like, where am I going to find her, is thinking like, well, what was she engaging with potentially, what did she have her hands on, what was she seeing, what was she looking at, what was she potentially hearing, right, as she was existing in Bennington, because the Black population in Bennington was very, very, very small, and we don't even get a census record until after she leaves Bennington. So again, it's all sort of speculative what she would have seen. I'm like looking at the panel right now. One of the things that she definitely did see, so the Catamount Tavern held prisoners of war, right? And there is this dramatization of this story of them parading the prisoners of war throughout Bennington, right? And there's a story that a Black man rode through town on a horse, guiding this procession. And this man was asked by Mary Robinson, who was the daughter of Stephen Fay, who was enslaving Peg Bowen. So if we're thinking through like the network of like who she might have been encountering, who she might have been seeing, I like to like picture this happening, because it's happening right in front of the Catamount Tavern. Is she standing in a window? Is she standing in the doorway as she's watching this procession happening and seeing this like moments of freedom and triumph and all of that going on, and also contemplating like what does it mean for me to be enslaved here in this moment while this is also happening, right? Because we're also seeing the Vermont Constitution being read, and it's the first in the nation to abolish adult slavery, right? That's written in 1777. She is sold back to Hadley and to the Phelps' family in 1778, right? And so she
who wrote that Constitution?
Jonas Fay, who's also the son of Stephen Fay. The Fays is a really interesting family. Stephen Fay is, I would consider, a revolutionary man. Like, he had 3 sons that fought in the Battle of Bennington. And there's another story about like one of his sons died in battle, and Stephen Fay says like, well, I'm happy like this is the way in which he would like leave this earth, like fighting for his country and all of that, right? And he talks about how they had to bring his son's body into the Catamount Tavern and he like washed his son's body in blood to kind of prep him for burial, right? Who's bringing the basin of warm water? Who is bringing the rags? Who is taking all of that away, right? Who might be helping scrub his body? Could that have been Peg? We also know that they had a big family. When Peg arrives in Bennington, Rosanna is how old? She's maybe like 10 or between 10 and 13. It's escaping me right now. There's so many dates. But his second youngest son is like the exact same age as Rosanna. So, 11. So as she is leaving behind her children to go and take care of this man and his children and his household, we can only imagine sort of the tensions that she's dealing with in that moment. While she's also, when she comes back to Hadley, her life is radically different. Her daughter has passed, like both of them. One daughter has passed, both daughters have
One
passed.
daughter's had a baby.
One daughter's had a baby and the other one has passed. And she has a granddaughter that kind of keeps her, I think, tied to this household in a lot of ways. But like her whole world in that moment is radically different, even as she like eventually gets her freedom. So yeah, that was my little spiel. There's so much. If you guys have any questions, I welcome any questions.
So she was in Vermont at the
Yeah.
time the decision was made. They have a constitution that created abolition.
Yeah.
It may just be a timing thing, maybe I didn't misunderstand, but why was she not free?
That's a great question. That's the golden question. Where it's not being, I think we witness oftentimes just because something is law does not mean that everyone necessarily follows that law. And also, it's inconvenient, and also she sold back, right? So what would have happened if she stayed in Bennington longer? We don't know how that could have been shifted, but also
The Fays
the
avoided
phase avoided it.
her
So, I mean, I
staying.
would assume there must have been some kind of litigation. There might have been some litigation in Vermont around the question of enslaved people who were enslaved in the slave states like Massachusetts, where were in residence in Vermont. There must have been some legal rulings on that. I'm just curious.
So it's, Vermont was the first state to do this.
Right.
And they weren't a state yet, but, they were actually an independent nation at the moment that they did this. So there wasn't precedent or anything. There's a fair amount of evidence that there were lots of enslavers who kept their slaves after the Vermont Constitution. So there's a book that I'm now forgetting the name of the gentleman who wrote it that's called Slavery in Vermont, but basically shows how that there were quite a number of people. It feels to me a little more galling with the Fays because Jonah Fay, the son, was the person who drafted, who authored, kind of like the Thomas Jefferson of the Vermont Constitution. He wrote it. And his signature is on the bill of sale in 1778, a year later, that sells Peg back. So there's zero chance that he does not know what's in the Vermont Constitution, right? He knows what it said, and he collaborates with his father to not just lose this enslaved possession, but instead to make some profit out of it. And he doesn't have to do it in a complicated way because he already had a trade relationship with Charles Phelps. He had purchased, he had purchased Peg.
And there were exceptions like that a lot. In fact, there's an academic at Harvard, I was just reading about her work. She's from Cincinnati, where we lived for years. And she wrote a book about slavery in southeast Michigan, in the Detroit area, in the colonial period, and then after the Northwest Ordinance. And what I think, as I recall reading about it, what she found out, correct me if I'm wrong, is that even though the Northwest Ordinance, which established the Northwest Territory, which includes Ohio, Indiana, Michigan, and something like that, it called for those territories not to have slavery. Slavery actually lingered in Detroit and in the Detroit area for years afterward, and it was the federal government either wrote that into law or looked the other way. I'm not sure, but that's fairly typical.
Right.
What is, in other words, what is abolition? Really, I mean, that's really the reason the 13, 14 to 15 amendments were passed, was to define it, but otherwise, what did it really mean?
I mean, one of the things that's interesting in this case is Elizabeth Porter Phelps kept a diary, which is one of the big sources of information about all of these people, because she wrote about daily life. And she writes about Peg's emancipation, and she writes that Peg went off free in a kind of huffy tone, like Peg went off free. And she didn't say, we freed Peg after all of these decades of service. She'd come when she was 12 years old, had been enslaved in the family when she was 12 years old. At this point, both her daughter and both of her daughters had died. You know, like, there are ways in which you could imagine them saying, okay, you've done enough, we'll liberate you in 1782, but that's not what she says. And she doesn't say Peg purchased her freedom either. She just says Peg went off free, which there's no more proof than what I'm saying right now, but it has that tone to me. I think of it as a kind of Juneteenth moment, like, oh, you've been emancipated all of this time in Texas, but nobody told you, right? I feel like, oh, she figured out that really she should have been freed in 1770s.
And I think that line also sort of speaks to the warped intimacy between Black women and white women specifically in the domestic space. Because, yes, Peg was there at 12. Elizabeth Phelps wasn't much younger, and so we can also assume that, like, Peg helped not only raise, like, her own Roseanne Phillips, but helped raise Elizabeth Phelps. And so thinking through this perceived intimacy on the behalf of Elizabeth, or whatever intimacy could have happened within this relationship between the enslaved and the enslaver, like, that also, I think, arises with this she went off free and this dismissiveness of, like, how dare she, we spent so much of our lives together and intertwined in this very unconsensual way. And so I also get that from this, and I think that's a unique experience to thinking through just, like, the relationship between women in this moment, and in this area too, where there aren't, these enslaved women are in some ways isolated from each other. You're seeing Peg make these sort of, like, networks and connections outside of this household, but still she's rooted here into this space. And so, yeah.
We should probably see something about the British prisoners of war.
Yeah, sure, sorry. No, sorry to John Morrison and the entries. Caesar and Peg are also so important. I'll mention too, part of my research was looking at John Morrison and also the Andrews. For John Morrison, we know that he was in the 71st Regiment of Foot, and we were interested in trying to trace how he made his way to 40 acres. We, unfortunately, through conversations with scholars in the UK, muster rules that are documenting this early recruiting period for the 71st Regiment do not survive. So we are not sure really where John Morrison is coming from within Scotland, but we know when he's departing a port outside of Glasgow with his company. We know that he is sailing with his group in response to the siege of Boston, and the British troops are hoping to contribute to that cause. He's sailing on the HMS George. When he arrives, that ship is immediately captured by American troops. So he is never stepping foot on shore and engaging in combat. He's immediately captured from his own ship. The Highlanders had, as Karen's rightfully pointing out, had a very distinctive uniform. They're most known for wearing kilts and hose, this more traditional Scottish look, and especially in this early part of the regiment's recruitment, this is almost probably exactly how he would have, every garment and accessory he would have worn as part of his uniform. He is a prisoner of war, then on the ship, and he is listed, his occupation is listed as a laborer. Family tradition had always thought that he had been a gardener as well in Scotland before he arrived at 40 Acres, because he becomes the gardener here at 40 Acres. He's responsible for the North Garden's design, and the family calls him an ornamental gardener. But I think what's ironic is that he is listed as a laborer right next to other members of his company who list themselves as gardeners. So he could have chosen to list himself as that if that was indeed his occupation back in Scotland. But I think because he didn't, we should be thinking about Morrison's arrival at 40 Acres as another moment of kind of self-fashioning. That he realizes that this is another opportunity to restart my life in a new space with a different occupation, and just moves ahead in that direction. And initially, the other tidbit I'll mention about John is that he's initially intended for Hatfield when he was placed as a prisoner of war. We don't know why instead of Hatfield he winds up here at 40 Acres in Hadley, but that was what the jail records showed in his transfer. And then finally I'll mention George and Mary Andrews, who we started knowing very little about, and still there are many gaps in their stories. It's part of the trick of researching them. We have the family tradition has stated that George Andrews was a German soldier, but the Elizabeth Porter Phelps's diary in that time period in which the Andrews are coming to 40 Acres does not describe them as such. She says in 1782 that George and Mary, Dutch people, have come to 40 Acres to stay. And given the timing, it's very likely that they were placed as former prisoners of war who were then indentured servants. But we don't have that confident identification that George was absolutely serving in the military, and we don't have any regimental numbers or facts that associate him with a particular group. So he's very difficult to track and place in this longer history of German soldiers coming as part of the British cause. The Battle of Saratoga is probably one of the most famous in this particular area of the Northeast. But it's also very likely that Mary Andrews, his wife, who was also German, was with George every step of the way during whatever military service he was undertaking. Mary would have been assumed to be a camp follower, which is a term often used to cover both soldiers' wives and children who traveled, not just officers' wives or captains' wives, but general privates or soldiers in the military could have had their families with them at any point, as well as women like laundresses who were traveling and moving with military troops as they traversed up and down the East Coast during the Revolutionary War. So Mary would have had as equally as hard a journey as George would alongside him as a prisoner of war as they were moved from prison to prison during his time period. And when they came to 40 Acres, they set up as tenant farmers, and we know from Elizabeth Porter Phelps's diaries that they introduced the Phelpses to the tradition of Christmas for the first time, and that they celebrated several Christmases together.
And that Mary hardly spoke any English. And
yes.
It's kind of interesting. Elizabeth often, Lisa knows this from some of the work her students did, when she writes letters and she quotes different people, she puts on accented voices, and so it makes it very clear that Mary's English is quite limited.
And I'll say too that one of the challenges of tracing them archivally is because their names are also probably anglicized. So whatever their German names, the spelling of their German names was likely changed in the paper documents of the Phelpses, which makes it a little trickier to track.
So they lived very differently than anybody who was enslaved, than Peg and Caesar. How different was that?
You mean indentured servitude versus enslavement?
And here it says.
Sure. So I'll say in general that indentured servitude often has a time limitation for that period of servitude. Usually it's an exchange of labor to compensate for some debt. So perhaps if you were immigrating from Europe, you might have to pay off the cost of your passage across by entering into an indentured servitude relationship. That's traditionally how it's been in the 18th century, but for the war in particular, prisoner of war indentured servitude is a little different. It arises from from the American Army's overwhelming inability to manage the volume of prisoners that are happening during this time period. It's a huge tax on infrastructure for the Army. You have to house, feed, clothe all of these prisoners of war, and there's also a lot of rituals and expectations as part of engaging in military combat during this time period that requires you to, exchange prisoners to extend a level of dignity and respect to their status as prisoners of war that means that they're usually in prisons for years. So it's a major tax on the Continental Army's budget, and to offset some of that cost, as well as to accommodate a major loss of labor, because Continental Army recruitments pull able-bodied men away from their homesteads, their communities, leaving gaps in local economies. So to accommodate for this, prisoners of war are placed in these communities and are working in exchange for housing, clothing, care, food, and to fill that labor gap as well. So that leads both John Morrison and the Andrews family to 40 acres. What's interesting is that they're both choosing to stay after the war permanently, and remaining here until all three of their deaths. And that is quite common. Hadley's not the only community in Western Massachusetts to have prisoners of war who stay well past the war's end to set up new life here.
I think the other thing I'd say differently in terms of your most specific question is Charles Phillips built a house for the Andres. So he was impressed enough with how valuable they were as farmers on his land that he was like, I want you to stay, I'll build you a house, which is really different than any evidence we have about how the people were enslaved here.
John Morrison had his own apartment.
And John Morrison had his own
He has
apartment.
autonomy over his space, and there's no record that Peg, enjoyed
I
the
can't
same.
hear you, I'm sorry.
Sorry, there's no record that Peg enjoyed the same autonomy of space that John Morrison and Georgia Mary
Could
did.
Andrews have been part of the convention army that passed through Hadley in 77?
It's certainly possible, but they're not arriving at 40 acres until 1782,
Right.
which means if he was part of the Convention Army, he would have traveled down from Saratoga through to Virginia and then back up again over to Cambridge. And that's certainly possible that they spent years on
He's
the
not
road.
on the muster from Saratoga.
Not that we're able to find at this stage.
I just have a question about those the German and Scottish prisoners. After the revolution was completed, there was a tremendous amount of immigration of Germans and Scots to the USA once it formed. Have you ever seen any scholarship that deals with did that experience, for example, where when these Germans and Scots were imprisoned, and they decided to stay and create new lives for themselves after the war, did the fact that those stories went back to Scotland and back to Germany, do we have any scholarship that shows that that's one of the reasons that a lot of Germans and Scots said, well, it's just, I don't like what's going on here. The aristocrats are taking my property in Scotland, or my clan rights are going away. I'm moving to the States. I'm just curious, was there any scholarship on
I'm not sure. I'm not aware of any scholarship that's thinking about those through lines, but I do think that we see the same kind of inspirational roots or those stories of early 19th century immigration in these stories as well, that even just the fact that John Morrison can go from a laborer in Scotland to an ornamental gardener here, and and categories are very rigid in Europe in this time period. So some of these motivations to immigrate for more opportunity, those themes are certainly present here as well, and maybe that's what inspired John to stay, or inspired George and Mary to stay. But it's also possible that just by being here, the idea of going back after such an experience was seemed bigger to overcome than just remaining where they were.
And these people were young too, so, yeah.
Yeah.
So I think we should make a little time for Elizabeth to tell us about, did all this research, collected all this new information, and then what happened?
organized it. Yeah. Well, it was such like rich material to work with, and we originally thought we might organize the exhibit by people, so sort of biographically organized, and we quickly found that that was a really limiting framework. Not only did we have sort of uneven amounts of information about each person, but by siloing them, we were missing like this broader story really that we were interested in telling. And so one of the graphic tools that we created, Olivia actually suggested, it's here at the bottom, and it asks, who was at 40 Acres at the same time? Well, you can come up. You can come up later. You might have to kneel down a little bit. And it really helps us see who was in relation, right, during these years. Who was talking to who was caring for one another, who was irritated by who. And that was sort of the first step in thinking about organizing the exhibit more thematically. One of the stories that came out of Emily's research that I loved so much was that we lost track of Caesar in Fort Ticonderoga. And I created this map all the way up on the end to show how far Fort Ticonderoga is from Hadley. That seems logical. Right. And then I thought, well, where's Bennington? And then I was like, well, where's New Marlborough? And so my vision of 40 Acres actually expands. The landscape of what 40 Acres is and the experience of the people who lived here now includes, in my mind at least, southern Vermont, northern New York State. And, you know, in Emily's research, I learned that there was a lot of sort of chaos around Christmas time, 1776 at Fort Ticonderoga. I think it was a period of reenlistment, like you mentioned, but there was also like a riot, like a racially motivated violence between the battalions of Pennsylvania and Massachusetts. And that's the moment that we lose Caesar. So, like, the role of speculation is always sort of interesting when you do work like this. But in doing the map, I realized Caesar was very close to where he lived before he arrives at 40 Acres. And so in realizing that, my attention was drawn to the broad network of free and enslaved Black people across New England at this time, Afro-Indigenous families who are invisible in many ways in the records that we have access to currently. And so in making the map and thinking about who is here at the same time, like the landscape of who's involved really expanded for me. And so when we organize it thematically, I think we get to see connections that aren't available to us when we talk about individuals. And then, you know, smaller things emerged, like Rosanna gives birth the same day that Paul Revere rides to warn of the approaching British to Lexington and Concord. So, and that for me reminded me that like life continues, right? Amidst big conflict, amidst this like, we talk about the rhetoric of the revolution and how that's navigated in people's individual lives. Births are happening, deaths are happening, the butter is still being churned. So I think there's something in that that brings us back to the daily life and reminds us that these people, that what we now have the benefit of looking back on, right? With our narrow focus, we get to say like, I'm going to look at muster rolls, or I'm going to look at shoes, which I do a lot. They didn't have the same luxury of that, right? Like, they have a much more expansive experience, and organizing it in this way helped me at least to get closer to what that experience might have been.
I'll ask you to say something about maybe the very last panel.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Well, Dr. Huntington, who founded the museum, opened it to the public in 1949, and when all of you take a tour very soon, I hope, you would see the rooms staged as Dr. Huntington left them, right? So what you see inside the house is exactly his vision of his sort of family's genteel history. He was very careful to arrange the house according to what he was interested in preserving
and Marla Miller here has done a ton of work on this, so I'm pulling heavily from your writing, thank you. He wasn't very interested in preserving the farm necessarily. He moved the Great Barn to Hadley, and that's on Route 9 now as part of the Farm Museum. He was interested in staging the family's artifacts to reflect a particular genteel history of the colonial era. And in doing so, he recreated this colonial imaginary for his visitors. And at the top of this panel, you can see Dr. Huntington in the center, dressed as his ancestor, literally wearing the mantle of his great-great-grandfather, who was an enslaver. And so when we think about commemoration, it's a little tricky, but it always reflects our values. So we've included this quote from Ty Sedgwill: "We do not change history, we change commemoration. The facts of the battle will always remain the same, but who or what we choose to commemorate from that battle reflects our values." One of our board members made the point that history actually doesn't. History changes,
Right.
but
the facts of the battle
is that, yeah, exactly. We'll be happy to chat about that after. But the point is that commemoration reflects our values, and the values of Dr. Huntington are on view in the house. The values of this team and this community are on view in this room today. And there's a number of artifacts that Dr. Huntington elevated in the collection because they tell a revolutionary history. One being a tea set, it's china, that was gifted to General Major Benjamin Lincoln. Dr. Huntington was very proud of his family's connection to this Revolutionary War figure. And we've included some text that I'll let you read the text about the china, but we've interpreted a number of the items connected to that figure to tell a broader story of the labor that supported them. So again, sort of expanding these stories that are familiar to us from high school U.S. history to tell we're expanding the battlefield, so to speak, to draw from the February month.
So I can take one or two more questions, but I also want to say there's lemonade and cookies on the veranda. And we really want to give you time to look at the texts, the exhibit that Olivia and Emily and Elizabeth created.
There was a hand back here.
Yes.
Is there any documentation or knowledge of any Native American slaves or indentured people who lived and worked here?
Could you repeat the question?
Yeah, is there any information on Native American enslavement or indentured servants that work here?
So we have, go ahead.
Yeah, well, this panel here speaks to,
Can you repeat the question
one more time, yes.
Thank you.
Is there any evidence of indigenous folks on the site at this time? Asena is a woman that shows up in Elizabeth Porter Fox's diary after the Revolution. And we know that she was hired as a wage laborer to work in the dairy. What we know about her is that she and her mother worked for a number of area homesteads. And her mother certainly would have lived through the Revolution, presumably. And so we have her name, and we have some of the tasks that she did on site. And I think that it draws our attention to a network of names that we don't know yet. But it reminds us that this is on the edge of the American Revolution, we use the term transnational to reflect the sovereign nations of indigenous people who were fighting this war on both sides, people of indigenous heritage who are making their own choices about where they fell in this conflict, and we do have this one woman, Asena, and her implied family, but nothing beyond that yet.
I just want to say one quick thing. One of the reasons that it's probably difficult to find a lot of records of a lot of indigenous people in the 1770s is that 100 years earlier, at the time of King Philip's War, one of the ways that war ended is that indigenous people were rounded up in this region and all over New England and shipped out of the ports of Newport and other ports along Long Island Sound to the Caribbean to die in the sugar plantations as enslaved people. So there was a deliberate depopulation and enslavement of indigenous people
as punishment for their opposing the settlement of Western Massachusetts, and that's one of the reasons
I
that.
think both things are really important to hold, like to recognize all of the truths of displacement, and also to recognize the ways in which there continue to be Indigenous presence in this place,
Oh, yeah.
even though people often had said it was disappeared. And so Asena is a mark of the latter bit of that. But yes, for sure.
You had something you wanted to.
I know a lot of the gentry in the surrounding towns were royalists. It doesn't appear that the Phelps were,
Right.
but were they really political patriots, or did
So-
they go along with it?
One of the things we didn't talk about today, because it wasn't so much new research, but it is part of the panels, was is Elizabeth Porter Phelps's diary that she kept through the revolution, and you can really watch her changing attitude. So I think she is pro-revolution. She's not a Tory ever, but she's she becomes more revolutionary or more invested in American independence over the course of the war.
Thanks for teaching us about the people involved here. What can you say about the site? You talked about 40 acres in this farm. Back in the day, the late 1700s, what were they growing? What were they doing? What was this site like a few hundred years ago?
Talk about what?
Agricultural history.
Agricultural history. I mean, I would say there was quite a range of agricultural growth. The money business for this farm in the 1770s through 90s is cheese. So the dairy farm is the sort of the biggest piece. And so that big barn, that was built right after the war. It was built in 1782. So I'm looking at people who are going to better understand than I am. Right. But so the barn that is the Hadley Farm Museum's building was the barn here. And it was built in 1782. So that's another thing, like movement time, all of these things. So the year that Peg goes off free is the year after her daughter has died, and the year that barn got finished. So, and you do get a lot of complaints in the report of Phelps's diary about, like, Charles thinks we should have more cows, more work for me. So they're moving towards that in the 1770s, and then it really takes off after the war.
And the other
Yeah,
thing
and
is
said,
that
let Marla say more.
Well, I just wanted to add something to that is a new avenue of inquiry for me and for other people who are interested in this kind of stuff. A lot of the agriculture in that period, like, it's past the period of enslavement, so we think that that something has changed, but what really has happened is a lot of this agriculture is going to southern colonies that can't devote any land or don't want to devote any land to agriculture. And so for many years when I worked on the cheese making that was here, and that gets shipped to Boston, I assumed people in Boston were eating it. And I no longer think that. I think it's going on ships to the Caribbean, and that's the same is true for, like, Connecticut's giant onion trade, that's going to the Caribbean. Draft animals, farm animals, hogs. Much of New England's agricultural wealth is generated by the shipping of all that to the south.
and the beauty of research is it sends you to do more research.
Very true.
That's the beauty of it.
I think that may be a perfect last line. So